What if I told you that your worst winter, your coldest, hungriest night, would barely count as a good day for a medieval peasant? No central heating, no grocery stores, just darkness, silence, and a fire that never burns long enough. This isn't a survival game, it's real history, and most of us wouldn't last a week. Tonight, we step into a world where comfort doesn't exist, where warmth is a battle and dinner is whatever hasn't frozen solid. This isn't just history, it's survival. Not of warriors or kings, but of the quiet souls who refuse to freeze. Hey, whenever you're watching this, morning, afternoon, or night, I'm grateful you're here. It's easy to forget how powerful it is to connect with people across time zones and lives. It's always amazing to see the reach of this strange, thoughtful little community. Now, wrap up warm, because what we're stepping into isn't just a story, it's survival. So dim the lights, throw a blanket over your shoulders, and maybe light a candle if you've got one. Because tonight, we're going back to a time when surviving the cold wasn't just hard, it was everything. Let's begin. You don't need a medieval calendar to know winter has arrived. You feel it first in your joints. They start creaking like the barn door. Then your breath turns visible and the dog starts sleeping closer. Not out of love, out of strategy. He knows what's coming, and soon, so do you. Autumn doesn't end in a dramatic flourish. It just fades out like a dying song. The last vegetables get pulled from the ground, the wind grows teeth, the trees look like skeletons, and suddenly, your whole village walks faster. Not out of urgency, just to stay warm. You tell yourself you're ready, but no one's ever really ready. The hut you live in isn't insulated. It's patched with straw, mud, and blind optimism. The roof leaks. The windows are just holes stuffed with cloth. The fire is a stubborn little god who needs constant feeding. And the woodpile? It's already too small. It always is. You wear the same tunic you wore in the fall, now with a cloak that's mostly holes and a prayer. Gloves? Maybe, if your cousin didn't borrow them last year and never return. Socks? Sure, if you count scraps of cloth tied around your feet and hope as socks. Inside the hut, you share a single room with 6 other people, 2 chickens, a goat, and 1 bed that groans under the weight of despair. Privacy isn't a concept. It's a luxury no one can afford. You sleep huddled like firewood, wrapped in rough blankets, pressed up against family members you're only sort of fond of. Because body heat is free, barely. Food becomes strategy. The root cellar holds whatever didn't rot, cabbages that look like they've seen things, onions that cry for you, turnips that were already disappointing in the fall and now feel like betrayal. The stew pot stays on the fire, day and night. It's not so much cooking as it is accumulating. Everything goes in. Scraps, bones, regret. And if you didn't dry enough beans or salt enough pork during harvest season, you'll find out soon. Winter has a way of revealing every bad decision you've ever made. Eggs? Not in this weather. The hens have unionized and stopped laying until further notice. Milk? Only if the cow hasn't frozen her udders off. And meat? If you're lucky, a rabbit. If you're unlucky, someone else's rabbit. Either way, keep it quiet. And then there's the cold. Not the cute kind of cold where you can see your breath and smile at the snow. No, this is the kind of cold that settles in your bones like debt. It doesn't just bite, it lingers. Every surface in your home is cold to the touch, even the blankets, even the dog, even your own thoughts. You start waking up in the middle of the night, not because you're uncomfortable, that's a given, but because the fire's gone out. And now you have to choose. Leave the blanket cocoon and risk freezing while fumbling for wood, or stay put and slowly turn into a person-shaped icicle. Neither is a win. And don't forget the firewood. Chopping wood isn't just a chore, it's a lifestyle. You chop, you haul, you stack, you curse, you do it again. If you're lucky, your axe head doesn't fly off mid-swing and decapitate the goose. If you're unlucky, you sprain something and now you're cold, tired, and limping. By mid-January, the pile you swore would last until spring is reduced to a few suspiciously damp logs and a half-burnt fence post. You make eye contact with the chair, the good one, and wonder if it's flammable. It is. Everything is, if you're desperate enough. By February, your whole world shrinks to the radius of the hearth. Everything important happens within 3 feet of the fire. Cooking, mending, arguing, not because it's the warmest part of the house. It's the only warm part of the house. And yet, the fire doesn't just keep you warm, it decides your mood. A strong flame means a slightly less miserable day. A weak one means someone sleeping with cold feet and a grudge. You start assigning value to logs, not just by size or dryness, but by how emotionally attached you are to the thing you're about to burn. Spoiler, you burn it anyway. You ration your heat. Morning fires are rare. Wood is for evenings, when everyone gathers in silence, watching the flames like they owe it money. No one's talking. No one's smiling. The fire is the entertainment, the comfort, the last line between you and despair. It crackles, pops, smokes up the whole hut. But you don't complain, because that smoke, that's warmth, that's life. And if you're really lucky, someone tells a story. Usually one that's been told 100 times. About a wolf the size of a cart. Or the winter when Grandpa survived 3 weeks on turnip peels and sheer spite. You know how it ends, but you still listen. Because it's not the story that matters, it's the distraction. Even the animals join in. They gather closer to the hearth, forming their own strange council of survival. Chickens under the stool, the goat behind the bench, the dog somewhere between the stew pot and your cousin's feet. You don't question the arrangement. It works, mostly. The nights are the worst. Long, silent, crushing. The darkness feels heavy, like it has a texture. You light one candle, maybe two, but wax is expensive, and the light only reaches so far. You sit near the flame, stitching rags or darning socks, pretending your fingers aren't going numb. Sometimes someone brings out a book. One book. It's been in the family for decades, and nobody really reads it, but flipping through the pages feels like rebellion. Then comes the part of winter no one likes to talk about. Illness, because cold doesn't just make you uncomfortable, it makes you vulnerable. Coughs linger, cuts don't heal, fevers spread like rumors. And there's no doctor, just your neighbor Edith, who once cured her own rash with boiled moss and now considers herself qualified. Her remedies include onion poultices, warm beer, and prayers mumbled aggressively under breath. If you're lucky, the fever breaks. If you're not, well, you get wrapped in your best tunic and buried before the ground freezes solid. And if it is frozen, then they just stack you somewhere until spring. Not joking. Children are especially at risk. Their bodies are smaller, weaker. You lose one to a cough, another to hunger, another just fades, and no one talks about it too much. Not because they don't care, but because grief is a luxury you can't afford. Meanwhile, the chores never stop. You carry water, you feed the animals, you patch the roof for the 4th time. Nothing works. Everything leaks, and you're always cold. Always. There's no escaping it, only enduring it. And through it all, you're haunted by one question. Did we store enough? Enough wood? Enough grain? Enough goodwill with the neighbors to maybe borrow some cabbage when things get desperate? Because no matter how much you prepared, it's never quite enough. Winter always finds the holes. In your roof, in your food supply, in your spirit. You start doing the math in your head, not by calendar, by inventory. 3 sacks of oats, 2 barrels of pickled things, 1 side of bacon that's mostly bone. You try to make it last. You try to be careful. But some days the hunger just wins, and you eat more than you should, and you regret it immediately. That regret becomes a regular visitor, along with doubt and restlessness. You start pacing the hut, not for exercise, but because movement is heat, and sitting still too long makes the cold creep up your spine like a spider. You watch the weather, every morning, staring at the sky like it owes you something, hoping for a hint of thaw, just a little sunshine, a break, something to say, hang on, it's almost over. But most days, you get more gray, more wind, more silence. Some days, the only sign of life is the sound of boots crunching frozen mud outside your door, a neighbor passing by, or a beggar making the rounds, wrapped in what might have once been a cloak, but now looks more like a patchwork quilt made by someone with a grudge. You give them a crust of bread, not because you're generous, but because you're scared you might be next. And the church. The church doesn't help much. The priest reminds everyone that winter is a test of faith, that God sends hardship to build character. Easy for him to say. He's got thicker walls, a steadier fire, and sometimes a goose. You sit on the cold stone floor, listening to sermons with blue fingers and numb toes, wondering if the Lord might consider a gentler lesson next season. Every so often, someone gets it in their head that the cold is punishment. For sin, for pride, for stealing eggs last spring. The whispers start, about witches, about curses. You don't believe it, but you also start sleeping with garlic over the door, just in case. And speaking of punishment, let's talk about toilets. There aren't any. You wake up at 3 in the morning, your bladder is full, the room is cold, the fire is out, and the outhouse is 20 feet away, across a yard covered in snow and things you'd rather not step on barefoot. So you bundle up, pray to your ancestors, and make the run. It's a sprint, a gauntlet. Every step is a gamble. You slip once, swear loudly, catch yourself on a post, keep going. You open the outhouse door and nearly faint. Because what's worse than going to the bathroom in freezing weather? Going to the bathroom in freezing weather over a pit of horrors that's been fermenting since October. You finish up, exit faster than you entered, and sprint back inside like your life depends on it. Because honestly, it might. One good slip, and you could break a hip on the frost, fall into the pit, or die of embarrassment. Back inside, someone's taken your spot near the fire. Doesn't matter. You wedge yourself in anyway. Sleep is shallow now, interrupted by wind, coughs, and the occasional chicken doing something suspicious. By late February, cabin fever sets in. Not the kind where you start hallucinating, the kind where every creak in the floorboards makes you want to throw a turnip. You know every noise this house makes, every groan of wood, every gust through the walls, every sigh from your mother, every passive-aggressive comment from your uncle about how someone didn't chop enough wood. You start arguing over everything. Who used the good log? Who finished the salt? Who didn't rinse the spoon properly? Tensions boil faster than soup, and the soup's not even boiling. At this point, the goat smells better than most of your family, and he's less judgy. Even laughter starts sounding weird, forced, hysterical, like the kind of laugh that's dangerously close to crying, but you let it out anyway, because it's either that or start talking to the cabbage again. And you still have chores. Oh yes, the work never stops. You mend clothes that are more whole than fabric. You stir stew that's 70% water and 30% desperation. You shovel snow just to get to the well. Then break the ice, draw water, and try not to drop it on your foot like last time. The bruise still hasn't gone away. Sometimes you gather twigs or dried grass, anything that might burn. You even eye the broom, not out of laziness, but because it's made of sticks. And sticks are heat, and heat is life. You become resourceful. You invent games with pebbles. You carve shapes into wood scraps. You listen to the wind and pretend it's telling you stories. You count the days by candle stubs, soup refills, and how many times someone says, "I can't feel my toes." And then, at long last, the first thaw comes. Not all at once, just a drip, then another. The snow softens, the roof leaks again, but this time it feels like progress. The chickens cluck louder, the goat actually moves. The dog lifts his head and blinks like he might believe in miracles. You step outside and your boots sink in mud instead of crunching on ice, and somehow that feels like victory. Spring doesn't arrive like a parade. It sneaks in. Quiet. Suspicious. You don't trust it at first. The sky turns a less threatening shade of gray. A bird sings, then instantly regrets it when a cold wind slaps through the trees. But the change has started. You can feel it in your bones. The ice in the bucket takes longer to form. The dog actually stretches instead of curling tighter. The firewood stack, now half gone and half regrets, doesn't seem as urgent. And still, nobody celebrates. You've been fooled before. Last year, a warm breeze showed up in March. Everyone got excited. Then it snowed again for 5 straight days. Froze the bucket, froze the cow's water, froze your will to live. So now you don't cheer, you test. Step outside, sniff the air, watch the sky, wait for the mud to dry, for the first green to push through the frost. And only then, maybe you say, it might be over. But even then, winter doesn't leave all at once. It clings, lingers, makes you earn your relief, and you're not done yet. Because now comes the reckoning. It's time to take stock. What's left? How many turnips made it through without turning into soup monsters? How many sacks of barley are still dry? How many family members still speak to each other? You count. You measure. You estimate how long until the garden can be planted again. How long until the hens lay eggs like they're supposed to? How long until the cow stops giving milk that tastes like sadness? And most of all, how long until you forget? Because here's the truth. Winter doesn't just leave marks on your body. It settles in your memory like smoke in the rafters. You remember the cold, the arguments, the silence, the stew that tasted like boiled cloth and disappointment. You remember chopping frozen wood until your fingers bled, holding your breath when your sister got a fever, sleeping with your back against the wall just to block the wind. You remember the moment the fire went out and nobody moved, because no one wanted to admit it was gone. You don't forget that, not fully, not for a while, but slowly, life creeps back in. The goats start eating again. The hens rediscover ambition. The snow melts off the roof and the thatch groans like it survived a war. And in a way, it has. So do you. Your fingers are rough. Your clothes are worse. Your patience is non-existent. But you made it. You survived another winter, not with glory, not with grace, but with firewood, stubbornness, and whatever was in that stew. You endured the hunger, the cold, the boredom, the bickering, the dark. And even though no one gives you a medal, no one throws a festival, and no one writes songs about it, you did it. You in your tiny wooden house full of goats and people you sometimes tolerate. And that, in the Middle Ages, is enough, because survival is the victory. You breathe deeper now. The air no longer burns your lungs. The door creaks open, and the wind doesn't punch you in the face. You step outside. The field looks dead, the trees still bare. But somewhere underneath the muck, the roots are waking up. And maybe, just maybe, you are too. See, surviving winter wasn't a season. It was a year-round strategy. Every single thing you did in spring, summer, and fall, it had one job: to stop winter from killing you later. You didn't garden because it was relaxing. You grew turnips like your life depended on them, because it did. You didn't salt pork for flavor. You did it so February wouldn't be the month you met God via starvation. Every step, every chore, every blister was a down payment on surviving the cold. Let's start with firewood. You chopped in summer. You chopped in autumn. You chopped like your entire existence was a lumber-based religion. Because it was. Without wood, your stew didn't cook, your hut didn't warm dry, and your toes, well, they didn't stay. And it wasn't just any wood. You needed dry wood. You needed stacked wood. You needed to pile it just right so it didn't mold, fall over, or become the local mice motel. And yet every single year, you ran out. By January, you were burning fence posts. By February, you were giving side-eye to chairs. By March, you were tossing in anything vaguely flammable: broken tools, old baskets, dreams. Every log was sacred, and you fought over them. Quietly, passive-aggressively, but fiercely. You remember who burned the good branch too early. You remember who tossed in damp twigs that smoked everyone out. You remember because it still smells like betrayal. And then there was food. Let's be honest. No one enjoyed preserved turnips. You ate them because fresh anything was a myth after November. You salted beans, you dried herbs, you hoarded onions like they were treasure. And even then, you barely scraped by. A successful winter wasn't full. It was not starving, that was the bar. And the root cellar, that was your dragon's hoard. Barrels of pickled things, sacks of grain, smoked fish that smelled worse than your cousin but still got eaten. Every bite was planned, rationed, argued over. You knew exactly how much stew could be made with 1 carrot, half an onion, and hope. And you didn't waste a thing. Bones became broth. Stale bread became filler. The last scrap of dried meat was split 5 ways, then chewed like it was sacred. Even the tools had to survive winter. Axes cracked, buckets froze, needles bent. You couldn't just replace them. You mended what you had. You reused, reworked, recycled. Sometimes a single pot had 3 handles, none original. And when something truly broke, you sighed. Deeply. Then cursed. Then figured out how to survive without it. That's what winter taught you. How to endure. How to adapt. How to push through even when everything screamed don't. Because giving up wasn't an option. There was no backup plan. No safety net. You either made it to spring, or you became a story someone almost told before they got too sad. And here's the truth most people forget. It wasn't just winter that was brutal. It was what it revealed. The cracks in the house, the cracks in your plans, the cracks in your family. Stress does things to people. Cold multiplies it. You said things. Others did too. You forgave some of it. Held on to the rest. Because even after the thaw, you remembered who shared their blanket and who didn't. In winter, your survival wasn't solo, it was social. You didn't just rely on your own strength. You relied on everyone's, whether you liked them or not. Because here's the deal. Winter didn't care about your grudges. That guy who borrowed your axe and never returned it, you still helped him patch his roof. That widow who never stops complaining, you still brought her broth. That cousin who smells like fermented cabbage and regret, you still shared a bedroll with him, begrudgingly. Community wasn't optional. It was the insurance policy against freezing to death in a hut that leaks sadness. Villages worked together, not because they were all saints, but because isolation kills. If your chimney collapsed, you needed help. If your child got sick, someone needed to fetch herbs. If your last turnip rotted, you prayed someone had a slightly less rotten one to spare. It wasn't generosity, it was co-survival. Wood chopping was often a group effort. Men, and whoever still had fingers that worked, gathered in the woods. They felled trees like they were fighting winter itself. Axes swung, backs strained, jokes were made, but not many. There wasn't the energy for that. They didn't talk about it, but they all knew. We're chopping wood together so none of us dies next month. Kids helped too. They scoured the forest for kindling, dragging back armfuls of sticks, brambles, pine cones, anything that might burn. It wasn't a game, it was a job. You didn't come back empty-handed, you didn't whine, you didn't stop. The elderly, they stirred stew, spun wool, told stories so people remembered how not to fall apart. Even the animals were part of the system. Cows provided milk when they weren't freezing. Chickens laid eggs when they felt like it. And pigs, well, pigs were warm, like portable fireplaces with hooves. Some slept indoors, not for fun, but because body heat was more reliable than fire. You got used to the smell. Mostly. It was chaotic harmony, noise, smell, heat, arguments, and somehow, warmth. And when things got really bad, when the snow blocked roads and the wind made your bones ache, you didn't knock on your neighbor's door to borrow sugar. You knocked to share silence, misery, maybe a story, maybe just a log. And when someone died, because someone always did, you all showed up. Not for the funeral. That came later. You showed up to help, to hold tools, to patch the roof, to bring food. Grief had no room to sit. There was work to do, because death in winter didn't pause life, it sharpened it. And yet through all that, something strange happened. You laughed. Not often, not loud, but sometimes someone cracked a joke that made the stew dribble out your nose. Sometimes, the goat did something so stupid that even your bitter uncle chuckled. Sometimes someone started singing and the rest joined in, badly but together. It didn't make the cold stop, but it made it hurt less. Because laughter, even rationed, was heat, and every bit counted. So no, winter wasn't just a test of endurance. It was a test of connection. Who helped, who shared, who stayed kind, who didn't. And you remembered, not just the people who let you freeze, but the ones who made room near the fire when you needed it most. That memory stayed with you longer than the frostbite. Here's something most people forget about medieval winter. It wasn't just a war of hunger and cold. It was a mental siege, because once the food is rationed, once the wood is stacked, once the fire is burning and the stew is boiling, what's left? Silence, stillness, time. Way too much time. And that's when the trouble starts. Days blur into each other. The sun rises gray, sets gray. You stop counting days by names. You count them by how many candles you've used, how many times you've stirred the same pot, how many arguments you've had about things that don't matter because they're the only things left to talk about. You wake up in the dark. You go to sleep in the dark. Everything in between? A loop of repetition, tedium, and low-grade existential dread. So what do? You invent distractions. You spin wool, even if you don't need thread. You sharpen knives that don't need sharpening. You stir the stew just to hear the sound of something. You sweep floors that are already clean. Then again. Idle hands don't just make mischief, they make madness. So you stay busy, not to be productive, but to stay sane. Kids carve shapes into wood. Adults hum songs. Elders recite stories, half memory, half mythology. You talk about next spring's planting, even if you know full well you'll be eating the seed grain by March. Hope isn't realistic, it's mandatory. And then there are the games. No chess, no cards, nothing fancy, just things you make up on the fly. Rock counting, story guessing, stick drawing, who can stare at the fire the longest contests. Everyone cheats, but you still play. Because even a bad game is better than another hour of sitting in silence wondering if your toes still count as toes. And of course, there's always the option to talk, except talking in winter can be dangerous. There's no privacy, no pause button, no stepping outside to cool off. If someone says the wrong thing, the fight doesn't end. It lingers. That time your cousin accused you of stealing the last dry log, you're still not speaking. You still glare at each other over the stew pot. You still remember. Because the walls don't keep out much, but they trap everything inside. So you learn to tread carefully, speak softly, apologize even when you don't mean it. Not for peace, but because you have 3 more months of sleeping 8 inches from that person's face. And the worst part? The dreams. You dream of warmth, of bread that's soft, of a bed with a mattress, of a sky that's actually blue. Then you wake up, back in the same drafty hut, same scratchy blanket, same chicken glaring at you from the rafters. You don't cry, that's a waste of salt. You just sigh, deep, long, and get up again, because winter doesn't care that you're tired. It doesn't care that you're cold. It doesn't care that your mind is unraveling like a threadbare sock. It just keeps going, and so do you. Not with joy, not with ease, but with the quiet, desperate determination of someone who refuses to let the season win. Not every winter was survivable. Some were worse. They had names, whispered ones. The harsh freeze, the hunger year, the black snow. Not because the snow was literally black, but because by the time it melted, too many doors stayed closed. Too many fires went out for good. You remember those winters? Everyone did. Because some years the weather didn't just challenge you, it crushed you. The cold came earlier, stayed longer. Snow buried paths, collapsed roofs, iced over rivers. Wood froze before it could burn. The stew pot boiled less often. The grain bins echoed. Animals died first. Chickens froze on their perches. Cows stopped producing milk. Then came the pigs. You tried to stretch the meat, salt it, smoke it. But sometimes it just turned before you could eat it. And the hunger, it didn't show up all at once. It crept in. First, meals got thinner, then smaller, then fewer. Bread that once fed 4 now fed 7. Stew that once had carrots now had hope. And eventually, the turnips ran out. You think that's a joke. It's not. Because after the turnips, there's nothing left but bark, roots, and the bitter knowledge that spring is still weeks away. That's when people change. Neighbors stop answering their doors. Children stop playing. Laughter disappears. Even the dog stops wagging his tail. He knows what's coming. You don't hear songs anymore. You hear whispers about old folk remedies, about unusual meats, about what to do when someone dies and there's nothing left to bury them with but snow. It gets bleak, fast. People talk less and stare more. You start to bargain. If the cow gives milk today, I won't complain for the rest of the week. If the stew feeds us tonight, I'll chop double tomorrow. If I wake up warm, please let me wake up warm. And if you're religious, and you probably are, you pray like it's a full-time job. You beg the sky for mercy. You thank the saints for nothing going moldy. You try not to think about the devil, not because you don't believe, but because you suspect he's already squatting in your chimney. And in the worst winters, even faith begins to crack. You start asking the dangerous questions. Why us? Why again? What if spring doesn't come this time? People don't answer. They just poke the fire and stare harder. And sometimes, people vanish. A cousin goes out for wood, doesn't return. A neighbor says they're visiting family, but the family never sees them. A child gets sick. No one talks about them after. You know the truth. But you don't say it. You don't have to. Because when the cold is bad enough, when the cupboards echo and the air inside bites just as hard as outside, survival starts taking on strange shapes. It's not just about rationing food. It's about rationing hope. You give yourself small reasons to keep going. One more day, one more fire, one more ladle of broth, one more breath. Because that's all you can do. And then, almost without warning, the world softens. The snow doesn't fall, it drips. The wind loses its bite. The trees stop looking like skeletons. The sky, still gray, begins to flicker with a blue you almost forgot existed. You hear the first bird. You don't believe it. Not at first. You freeze. Listen. Was it real? Did you imagine it? Then it calls again. High, sharp, hopeful. You look at your cousin. They look back. Neither of you speaks, because if you say it out loud, you might scare it away. But you both know what it means. Something has changed. Outside, the snow thins. The ice on the well cracks. The mud returns. Filthy, wonderful mud. the kind that steals your boots and ruins your socks and feels like life itself. You step out one morning and realize you're not shivering. It's still cold. Of course it is, but it's different now. Less like punishment, more like a stubborn guest finally packing up their things. The fire still burns. But it doesn't feel like your only chance at survival anymore. Just warmth, comfort, a choice. And inside the hut, things begin to move again. The goat bleats louder. The chickens peck with purpose. The dog stretches, sniffs the air, and trots toward the door like it's guarding something important again. Even people change. Your mother hums while stirring the pot. Your sister smiles, an actual smile, not the tired, frozen grimace she's been wearing since December. Your uncle makes a joke, a bad one, but no one yells at him for it. And then, one morning, the stew tastes better. You didn't do anything different. It's the same 3 ingredients and boiling water, but it tastes good. Or maybe your brain just finally allowed you to enjoy something again. And that's how it starts. Not with festivals or feasts. Not with fireworks or trumpets, with quiet moments. One less cough at night. One more egg in the morning. One beam of light that actually feels warm on your skin. These are the first victories. And soon, you do something bold, reckless even. You step outside with bare hands, not for long. Just enough to feel the air, cold, damp, alive. You go down to the cellar, take stock, half a sack of barley, some pickled beets, one final onion. That's more than some, less than others. But it's enough. You look at the roof. It held. You check the wood pile. It's low, but it made it. You glance at your family. They're tired, pale. But here, you lost things this winter. Maybe people, maybe pride, maybe peace of mind. But you're still here. And in the Middle Ages, that counts. So you start planting again, not out of joy, but because that's what comes next. Because even though your hands are cracked and your back still hurts from chopping firewood in December, the soil calls, the seeds wait, and spring, like survival, must be earned all over again. But this time, you do it with the weight of experience. You remember what worked, what didn't. You plan better. You hope harder. You plant more, because another winter is coming. You just bought yourself time. And this year, maybe you'll be ready. By the time the thaw is complete, you've changed. You're not the same person who watched the first flake fall back in October. You're thinner, tougher, a little quieter, a little meaner maybe, but also sharper, wiser, and strangely, more grateful. Because surviving winter isn't just about endurance, it's about transformation. It broke you, bent you, chilled you to your soul, but it also rebuilt you. It stripped away the soft parts, the illusions, the luxuries. And what was left, the bones, the will, the grit, that's the part that survived. You learned things. You learned how many ways there are to cook a turnip. You learned exactly how long it takes to dry wet socks near a bad fire. You learned that even when you think you have nothing left to give, there's still one more log, one more spoonful, one more breath. You learned that firewood is more valuable than gold. That stew is sacred. That hope isn't some poetic idea. It's a tool, carved and hammered like anything else. You learned who to trust, who to rely on, who to forgive, and who to never share a bedroll with again. And most of all, you learned that warmth is not a guarantee. It's a goal. It's something you fight for. It's something you build together. It's something you protect, not just with logs and blankets, but with kindness, with resilience, with everything you've got. And now, with the frost retreating and the first greens poking through the muck, you look ahead. Another year. More planting, more chopping, more planning. Another winter waiting just a few seasons away. And it will come, as it always does. But you'll be ready, not because it'll be easier, but because now you know how. You'll plant the cabbages. You'll stack the firewood with military precision. You'll preserve, salt, pickle, dry, mend, and fortify. And when the cold comes howling again, you won't be afraid. You'll build the fire, stir the stew, share the blanket, and tell the next generation how you survived the winter of 25, or the hunger frost, or the one where the goat stole everyone's bread and you all laughed for the first time in weeks. You'll become the story. Because in the Middle Ages, you don't just pass down land or tools, you pass down survival. And that might be the warmest thing of all. Even in the bleakest winters, especially then, peasants clung to ritual. Because when the food ran low and the woodpile vanished and your cousin hadn't spoken in 3 days, you needed more than stew to survive. You needed meaning. Enter folklore. Every village had its own version of winter spirits. Some told tales of the ice hag, a frozen old woman who walked the hills and peeked in windows, looking for warm fires to snuff out. Others feared the ash thief, a creature made of soot and frostbite that crept into chimneys to steal the last glowing coal. You didn't just tell these stories for fun, you told them to keep children close, to make sense of the darkness, to remind each other, stay careful, stay warm, stay human. And of course, there were the rituals, solstice, midwinter feasts, offerings buried under the snow to wake the earth. Not because peasants were naive, but because ritual gave shape to time. It turned endless gray days into something structured, something sacred. Even if the feast was just a larger spoonful of barley. Even if the singing was off-key and your aunt kept inventing verses that didn't rhyme. You still lit the candle. You still said the words. Because surviving winter was about more than just not dying. It was about remembering why you stayed alive. And then there were the strange little superstitions, the kind passed down in whispers, the kind that didn't make sense but somehow mattered more than logic. Never sweep ashes after sunset. Don't whistle near a frozen window. Always leave a crust of bread for the house spirit. If the fire crackles too loud, someone's lying. Were they true? Probably not. Did people believe them? Absolutely, because belief, like stew, didn't have to be fancy. It just had to fill you up. And sometimes the best way to beat back the cold wasn't with firewood, but with story, with ritual, with the idea that maybe, just maybe, something was watching over you. Even if it was just your grandmother's ghost and she was mostly judging your posture. Knowledge was the most valuable thing you could pass on. Not land, not coins, not a decent pair of boots. Knowledge, because if winter had one rule, it was this. Someone always forgets. Someone always underestimates it, and someone always pays the price. But not if you remember, not if your parents told you which tree burns best, which root cellars never flooded, which spot in the woods still had dry twigs after a storm. Not if your grandfather showed you how to stack wood so it wouldn't rot. Not if your mother taught you how to boil barley so the pot lasted 3 days instead of 2. These weren't lessons. They were lifelines, passed down like sacred law. You didn't question them. You obeyed them, because someone, once, had learned the hard way. And every family had their winter story. The year the snow buried the house up to the roof. The year the stew pot cracked from the cold. The year the fire went out and didn't come back for 2 days. You heard these stories growing up. You rolled your eyes. You didn't take them seriously until your first real winter. The kind that makes your breath freeze midair and your blankets feel like paper. The kind that tests everything you thought you knew. And suddenly, that story about your aunt who made mittens from goat hair and bark doesn't sound so ridiculous. Suddenly, you're thanking your grandfather for teaching you how to dry moss near the fire without burning it. Suddenly, you're listening. Winter demanded memory, not just yours, everyone's. Because forgetting wasn't just foolish, it was fatal. That's why every child helped stack firewood. Not because it was easier with small hands, but because you needed to remember how. That's why you helped dig the cellar and salt the meat and patch the roof. Because when your parents weren't around anymore, it'd be your turn to protect the fire. And your turn always came. So you watched, you learned, you listened when the old ones said, no, not like that, and made you redo it. You didn't argue. You couldn't afford to. Because the moment you stopped respecting winter was the moment it reminded you why you should have. And so every spring, the lessons began again. Quiet, subtle, a nod here, a correction there. You didn't write them down. You didn't need to. They were stitched into your habits, into your hands, into the way you glanced at the clouds when the wind changed. Survival wasn't instinct, it was inherited. And if you were lucky, you'd pass it down too. Not for pride, not for praise, but because someone would need it. And you wanted them to live long enough to be the one telling stories next winter. There's no ceremony, no applause. No one gathers around the village square to shout, "We made it." Spring doesn't give medals, it just arrives. Subtle, reluctant, but real. And somewhere deep in your chest, right between the ache in your ribs and the soreness in your spine, something shifts. You realize you're still here. No one throws a feast. You don't throw open the doors and dance in the mud. But inside, you feel it. that small, stubborn flicker of pride. Not loud, not showy, but solid. The kind you earn, not through conquest or coin, but by refusing to quit. That's what winter survival really was. Not heroism, not glory, just refusal. You refused to give up when the stew was thin. You refused to stop chopping when your fingers split. You refused to lie down when the fire died out. You kept going and going and going. And now here you are, still standing, still shivering maybe, but standing. Your tunic's threadbare, your hands are calloused, your eyes are tired, but you made it. And for one brief moment, the wind brushes your face and it doesn't hurt, it refreshes. You look around, the mud is deep, the sky is pale, there's no food in the pot, but you're already thinking about planting. Because that's what survival means. You look ahead, not because it's easy, but because that's what you do now. You plant again, you stack wood again, you prepare, knowing full well that next winter is coming. And next time, it'll be just as cruel, just as long, just as cold, and that's fine. Because now, you're someone who survives it. Quietly, relentlessly, like your father did, like your grandmother did. Like their bones in the dirt beneath you whisper you should. You are part of the cycle now, the old rhythm, the endless push against the season that tries to erase you. And maybe you won't be remembered. Maybe no one will write songs about how you kept the fire alive one extra night. But that's all right. You remember. You know. And that is enough. In the end, surviving winter wasn't just about food or fire or fur-lined cloaks passed down from ancestors you barely remembered. It was about something deeper, something built into your bones, a kind of invisible armor. You couldn't see it, but you felt it every time you woke up before the sun and lit the hearth. Every time you went without so your sister didn't. Every time you told yourself, just one more day, even when your hands shook and your stomach howled. Winter tried to strip you down, make you fragile, silent, forgotten. But you pushed back, with kindling, with porridge, with stubbornness. You learned to see joy in steam rising off stew, in dry kindling on the coldest morning, in that one egg your chicken finally laid after months of silence. You measured wealth not in gold, but in warmth, in still beating hearts, in one more night huddled by the fire, even if the smoke stung your eyes. That was your inheritance, not comfort, not ease, resilience, and that's what you passed on. Every chopped log, every mended sock, every whispered prayer over a pot of boiling hope. All of it said the same thing. We don't give in, we don't give up, we survive. Because deep down, you understood what winter really was. It wasn't the cold, it wasn't the dark, it wasn't the hunger, it was the test. The one that asked, who are you when the world turns against you? And your answer, every day, every night, every frostbitten morning, was simple. I'm still here. And that was everything. By now, the worst is over, but the damage isn't. See, winter doesn't just test your firewood in your pantry, it tests your relationships. Nothing reveals people like a 3-month freeze with no privacy and too many mouths to feed. You learn who hogs the blanket, who stirs the stew too loudly, who secretly eats a little extra when they think no one's watching. You try not to keep score, but you do. Of course you do. There's no escape. No alone time. No stepping out for air unless you want frostbite. You argue over stupid things, who used the last of the lard, who tracked mud through the door, who left the latch open and let the cold in. The hut is small, the tempers are smaller. One bad word over a burnt crust of bread can spiral into a 2-day standoff. And still, you depend on each other. You hate each other sometimes, but you huddle closer anyway, because it's cold, and hate doesn't warm you. People do. You start to read moods like weather signs. The way your uncle exhales too sharply, that means keep quiet. The way your sister hums off-key, that means she's trying not to cry. You become expert at silence, at diplomacy, at saying it's fine, when it's absolutely not. But there's nothing you can do except survive next to the person who made it not fine. Winter makes you emotionally bilingual. One language for outside, one for inside, one for what you say, one for what you mean. You practice the art of pretending not to hear, not to notice, not to care. You get good at forgiveness, or at least pretending you have, because there's no spare room for grudges. Not when you're sleeping 8 inches apart and sharing soup. And in rare moments, you remember why you love these people. Someone cracks a joke, someone shares the last crust, someone says you take the warm spot, and suddenly you're reminded that survival isn't just about staying alive, it's about staying together. Because no one survives winter alone. Not really. If you were a child in a medieval winter, nobody waited for you to grow up before putting you to work. Childhood wasn't a protected class. It was just a smaller version of adulthood, with colder feet. You were useful the moment you could walk straight, and if you could carry a bucket, you could carry firewood. No one asked if your hands were too small. They simply handed you kindling and said, "Hurry." You didn't go to school. You went to the well. You fed the animals. You helped patch the roof with a broom and a prayer. You stirred stew, ran errands, turned frozen soil with a stick that used to be a toy. You knew not to waste food. You knew how to check if an egg was still good by floating it in water. You learned the signs of frostbite, not from a book, from your brother's fingers. You didn't play often, but when you did, it looked different. You made sleds from broken baskets. You had snowball fights that ended in real bruises. You told ghost stories in the dark to pass the time, then huddled closer because the dark was already real enough. Sometimes, your game was pretending to eat imaginary stew while your stomach growled like a dog. Other times, it was who could find the driest twig fastest. That one actually helped. You laughed, but not for long. Laughter used energy, and energy was precious. And winter taught you how fast a giggle could turn into a shiver. You knew people died in winter. That was normal. Sometimes you lost a friend. Sometimes it was your sister. No one explained it gently. They just wrapped the body and said nothing. You didn't cry loud. You didn't ask questions. You just carried the wood and moved on. But you noticed. You noticed everything. Who coughed at night, who sat too still for too long, who didn't get up one morning. You noticed because you were paying attention. Because that's what winter taught you. Watch. Listen. Stay near the fire. Don't fall behind. And yet, despite all of it, children still found ways to be children. You drew in the frost on the window with your finger. You named the goat something ridiculous. You whispered jokes in the dark and got scolded for waking your aunt. You survived, not because you were strong, but because no one gave you a choice. Night in winter didn't begin at midnight. It began by mid-afternoon. The sun dipped low like it was tired of trying, and within the hour, everything disappeared. The trees, the sky, the path to the barn, gone. Replaced by a darkness so thick it pressed on the walls of your hut like a second roof. And you felt it, in your bones, in your stomach, in the way your hand moved just a little faster toward the fire when the last bit of light left the window. There were no lamps, no electricity, just a candle or two. Maybe an oil lamp, if you were lucky. Wax was expensive. Oil didn't last. So you rationed the light, just like food, just like warmth. One flame in the center of the room, small, flickering. The whole family gathered around it like moths pretending they weren't terrified. You spoke softer at night, not because anyone told you to, because it felt wrong to be loud. The dark listened, and sometimes it answered. The wind scraped across the thatch like claws. Branches creaked like old bones. Something howled in the woods. Something else replied. You didn't ask questions. You threw another stick on the fire and stared at it harder. And if the fire burned too low, you didn't sleep. You watched. Because if it died, you had to start it again, in the dark, with flint and frozen fingers. And sometimes it wouldn't catch. And you'd sit there alone, praying to every saint you'd ever heard of, begging the spark to catch before the frost caught you. Most nights you slept in layers, not just of clothes, but of people. 3 to a bed, 4 if someone was sick. You slept face to face, back to back, foot to shin, whatever combination got you closest to body heat. There was no privacy. No shame, just strategy. The fire was your center. The candle was your countdown. When it flickered low, someone whispered, "Time." You snuffed it out, said nothing, rolled over, and hoped the morning came fast. Some families kept charms above the door. Bits of iron, dried herbs, a nail bent twice, not for decoration, for protection. Because night was when the things without names walked closest. And if nothing else, superstition was insulation. You believed what you had to. You believed that as long as the fire stayed lit, the cold stayed out. That as long as you kept a crust by the door, the spirit stayed fed. That as long as you didn't speak a name after dark, it wouldn't hear you. You didn't test it. Not in winter. Not at night. You just listened to the fire pop. Listened to the wood shift. Listened to someone cough. and waited for light. You didn't fear wolves, you feared coughs. A single cough could change the whole winter. It started small, dry, barely noticed. Someone blamed the cold, said it was the smoke, said it would pass. It didn't. It got worse. Louder, wet, rattling. You knew what came next. Fever, shivering, then sweating, then stillness. Maybe it was just a chill. Maybe it was something worse. You didn't know. You didn't need to know. You just hoped it wouldn't spread. Because winter had no doctors. The nearest healer might be miles away. The path there frozen. The cost impossible. And the cure? Probably a poultice made of garlic, moss, and good intentions. You had your own medicine, hot broth, damp cloths, wild herbs you didn't trust. A prayer mumbled into a bowl of steam. You wrapped the sick in every blanket, sat them closest to the fire, slept near them, even if you were scared, because no one died alone in winter. Not because you were noble, because you couldn't afford to be cold. If they got better, it was a miracle. If they didn't, you already knew how to wrap a body. You didn't talk about it. You just did it. And sometimes it didn't stop at one. Sometimes it swept through the hut, one after another, coughing, burning up. Then silent. You couldn't bury them. The ground was too hard. You wrapped them in linen if you had any, in old cloaks if you didn't, and you waited. The bodies stayed in the corner, covered, cold, quiet, sometimes for weeks, until the thaw, until the earth opened up again. And every time you looked at the spot where they laid, you wondered, did I do enough? The answer didn't matter. It was already too late. Sickness was like frost. It crept in silently, spread quickly, and left you brittle. And there were so many ways it could strike. Fevers, chills, bleeding gums, sudden rashes, a child waking up fine and dying by nightfall. You didn't understand it. You didn't have to. You just feared it. You watched for it like wolves in the wood. And when it came, you didn't run. You braced. You rationed broth. You whispered prayers. You fed them until they couldn't swallow. Then you just sat, holding a hand that didn't squeeze back, waiting for either sleep, or silence, or spring. When someone died in winter, the world didn't stop. It barely blinked. You didn't wail. You didn't collapse in the snow, the old poems say. You folded the blanket, tied the limbs, moved the body out of the way, because there was still wood to chop, still mouths to feed, still a fire to keep alive. Grief had no room to stretch, no space to scream. It just sat inside you, heavy and sharp. You didn't have coffins, just wraps, linen if you had it, wool if you didn't, sometimes just an old tunic sewn shut. And then, nothing. The ground was stone, frozen solid. You couldn't dig, not even with axes. So you waited. The body stayed, in the corner, or the shed, or the snowbank, covered in furs, sometimes next to another one, sometimes alone. You prayed for early thaw, not for planting, for burial, because you couldn't mourn properly until the body was gone. And sometimes, spring came late, and you sat beside someone's ghost for weeks, pretending they weren't there, pretending their boots by the fire were just waiting. You whispered their name once, then stopped. It hurt too much, so you spoke of them without saying them. You said, we need more wood. Not he always chopped wood. You said, move the pot. Not that was her job. Because remembering them out loud made the grief real. And real grief stole focus. And focus was survival. When the time finally came, when the ground softened, you dug fast. Quiet. You didn't want to look, but you did. Just once. Just to say goodbye. You didn't sing. You didn't kneel. You didn't place flowers. You placed dirt, then stone, then silence. That was your funeral. And for days after, the hut felt different. The air moved wrong. The floor creaked in new places. The fire didn't feel as warm. Someone took their spot. Not because they wanted to, but because it was cold. Because you needed to stay close. Because winter kept moving, and you had to as well. You didn't forget them. You never could. You just buried them twice, once in earth, once in memory. And then you picked up the axe, the bucket, the broom, and kept going. It wasn't all pain. It couldn't be. If winter was only cold, hunger, and death, people would have stopped trying a long time ago. But they didn't, because buried deep in the gray between the frostbite and the smoke, there were moments. Moments that made the misery worth dragging through. They weren't big, they weren't loud, but they were real, like laughter, not constant, but sharp, sudden. You're stirring soup for the 10th night in a row, nothing but turnip and regret. And someone says, smells better than yesterday. And someone else says, yeah, because I took my boots out of it. And you laugh, not because it's funny, but because it's something. And that's enough. Or the nights when someone tells a story so ridiculous it has to be half true. About a man who tried to build a sauna in his pig shed. About a rooster that cursed at nuns. About your great-aunt wrestling a fox over a chicken leg in the snow. Everyone's heard it before, but you still listen, because it beats silence. And for a few minutes, you're not just surviving, you're living. You find joy in absurd things. A dry stick, a warm seat near the fire, a rat that finally dies after keeping you awake for weeks, the dog sneezing itself awake and looking offended, someone finding a piece of dried apple at the bottom of the barrel. You split it 5 ways like it's treasure. You celebrate nothing, because nothing went wrong is something. And when someone sings badly, you let them. You don't join in, not always, but you smile, you tap your foot. You remember a time when the world was louder. Winter teaches you not to wait for perfect. It teaches you to celebrate just okay. A good sleep, a stew that doesn't make you gag, a day where no one coughs. These are victories, and somehow they feel bigger than any summer feast, because they cost more. You earned them, with frostbitten fingers, with sleepless nights, with prayers whispered into smoke. And when the fire burns bright enough, and no one's sick, and the hut is full, and you're warm for a moment, you close your eyes and smile. Because winter hasn't beaten you yet. The thaw was barely done when you started thinking about the next freeze. That's how it worked. You didn't get a break. You didn't get to say, we'll worry about it in October. Because you'd already learned, winter doesn't care about your timing. It comes when it wants. And when it does, it asks one question. Did you prepare? So you started early. As soon as the snow melted, you looked at what was left, how much wood, how much grain, how much you should have had. You made mental notes. Bigger stack, deeper cellar, better boots, more dried beans, fewer arguments. You fixed what broke, the roof tile that cracked under frost, the fence that gave way under snow, the pot with the split lip from one too many nights over the flame. You mended, patched, sharpened, adjusted, not because it was urgent, but because it would be. Summer wasn't relaxation, it was race. A mad sprint to outrun a season that always gained on you. Every log you chopped in June was a promise to your future self. Every cabbage planted in spring was a desperate hope that you'd still be around to eat it in February. You counted your chickens with fear, not pride. Would they live through the next freeze? Would you? Winter didn't just shape your actions, it shaped your mind. You hoarded things, you saved scraps, you distrusted ease. A warm day made you suspicious. A full belly made you cautious, because comfort was temporary. But cold was permanent. That's what it taught you. You didn't let go of fear. You repurposed it, turned it into work, turned it into jars and logs and bundles of wool stacked in corners like spells against what you knew was coming. Every day with sun was a gift. Every day with warmth was a lie, a kind lie, but still a lie. So you worked. You worked because no one ever said we had too much firewood. No one ever said we dried too many herbs. No one ever said we were too ready. That phrase didn't exist. And deep down, even as the birds sang and the fields turned green, a part of you stayed in January, watching the fire, listening to the cough, counting the logs. Because surviving once wasn't enough. You had to do it again. And this time, maybe better. By the time spring finally settles in, really settles in, you're different. Not just hungrier, not just leaner, but rewired. Winter didn't just test you, it rewrote you. It carved new grooves into your habits. Changed how you look at the world. You stop wasting things. You fold cloth with more care. You watch the fire with more reverence. You catch yourself counting. Counting days. Counting routes. Counting steps to the well and back. Not because you need to, because your brain never really left December. That's the secret people miss when they imagine the past. They think peasants lived season by season, but they didn't. They lived all 4 seasons at once. Every day in spring was a memory of the last freeze. Every day in summer was a warning. Every day in autumn was a countdown. And every day in winter was survival. You didn't shake that off. You couldn't. It was part of you. You knew people who didn't make it. Their names lived in your hands when you chopped wood, in your breath when you stepped outside and it didn't hurt, in the soup when it finally had flavor again. You carried them, quietly, constantly, like a second shadow. And it gave you this strange, steady pride. Not loud, not boastful, Just the knowledge that you bent but didn't break, that you suffered but didn't stop, that you came out the other side, not untouched, but still here. That mattered. You weren't a warrior, you weren't a noble, but you were resilient, the kind of resilience that doesn't make headlines. It just makes it through the night. That was your identity, not carved into a sword, etched into your routine. In the way you folded blankets, stirred pots, watched the clouds. In the way you nodded when someone said, "Next winter might be worse," and replied, "Then we prepare harder." Because winter didn't break you, it built you. Not into something pretty, but into something solid. There were no libraries, no journals, no letters from one winter to the next. What you knew, you carried in your mouth, in your hands, in the soft voice of someone older than the roof. That's how winter knowledge survived. Not through parchment, through people. You didn't read a guide on surviving cold. You listened. You remembered. You watched your father check the sky and say snow by sundown. You watched your mother stir a pot and know by smell if it needed more water. You watched your grandmother stack kindling in a way that never failed. And you remembered. You didn't call it teaching, it was just life. But you were learning every second. That's how it worked. Wisdom whispered, shared in small, quiet acts. No one gave a speech. No one sat you down and said, "This is how to survive the dark." They just did it and expected you to pay attention. And when it was your turn, you didn't explain either. You just showed someone how to tie the bundles tighter, how to keep the coals alive under ash, how to tell if the stew was going bad. And that person, your son, your niece, your neighbor's kid who wouldn't stop asking questions, they watched. And it went on, year after year, fire after fire, winter after winter. Spoken, repeated, worn smooth like a river stone. You'd be surprised what people remember. The way you folded the wool twice to trap more heat. The song you hummed to check how long to boil the water. The story you told when someone cried over a dead goat. These things lasted. These were your legacy. No monument, just a pot that didn't crack. A child who made it through. A neighbor who remembered how you cured the fever that year. And when you were gone, you stayed. In how they stirred the soup, in how they patched the roof, in how they said, "Add a little vinegar, trust me." That's how winter stories lived on. In the firelight, in the steam, in the silence between chores. You weren't a scholar, but you were an archive, and your life was the manuscript. In the end, winter survival wasn't about strength. It wasn't about knowledge. It wasn't about luck. It was about persistence, quiet, unremarkable, uncelebrated, but unbreakable. You didn't conquer the season. You didn't master it. You endured it. You outlasted it. One day at a time. One log, one bowl, one deep breath before stepping outside. That was the rhythm, the religion, the law of life in the cold. You didn't need to be a hero. You just needed to keep going. And every spring, when the ground softened, when the light stretched longer, when the goat made that same stupid bleating noise that meant he survived too, you felt it. Not joy, not relief, something quieter, validation. That you weren't weak for shivering, that you weren't a failure for being afraid, that you made it through something designed to make you disappear, and you stayed. That's the power of peasant survival. It wasn't glorious, it wasn't poetic, it was real, messy, dirty, cold, and completely extraordinary, because you didn't have backup, you didn't have safety nets. All you had was a hut, a fire, a stew, and the refusal to die. That refusal, that's what echoed through generations. That's what built villages. That's what outlived kings and empires and castles that collapsed under their own weight. A peasant in the snow with numb fingers stirring a pot, humming a broken tune. That's survival. That's defiance. That's legacy. So the next time someone romanticizes the past, the old world, the simple life, remind them of the frost, of the silence, of the hunger, of the fact that the people who lived through it weren't soft. They were steel wrapped in wool and smoke and soup, and they didn't ask for much, just warmth, just enough, just a chance to keep going, and somehow, they did. So when you light a candle on a cold night, when the wind rattles the glass, when your blanket feels a little too thin, and the dark stretches a little too long, remember them. The ones who came before, the ones who didn't flinch, the ones who endured. And maybe, just maybe, pull your chair a little closer to the fire.